Good afternoon. Welcome to the Assessment Inventory and Monitoring Data Use webinar series. We just want to remind our participants that you are automatically muted and that we welcome your questions. Please type them into the chat bar and we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Today we will have Lara Kobelt with the Southern Nevada District Office presenting Weeds and Desert Tortoise in the Southern Nevada District Office. Take it away, Lara.
Hi, everybody. Like Alita said, my name is Lara Kobelt, and today I'm going to be talking about AIM, weeds, and the Mojave Desert Tortoise. So welcome to the Mojave Desert, especially Las Vegas, Nevada. That's where I'm at. And this is me with Albert, who's my adopted Mojave Desert Tortoise. So just so you know who I am. And here's a wild desert tortoise. So this is our threatened species, Mojave Desert Tortoise. And in the Southern Nevada District with BLM, part of what we're doing is trying to get these threatened species off of the endangered species list. So our goal is for them to not be protected anymore because they don't need those protections. And so these guys are going to be the topic of conversation today. More specifically, what I see as my role in it as a botanist, natural resource specialist, is that when we're talking about recovering an endangered species, we also need to talk about recovering its habitat. So you can see this little guy in the foreground checking out his habitat in Las Vegas. And something we know about tortoises and their habitat is that invasive annual grass is bad for desert tortoises. And for those of you from the Great Basin or other places, I know you all deal with your own issues with invasive annual grasses. We do too down here, so I'll try not to beat that point too much. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but in the desert we have cheatgrass and red brome, which leads to decreases in our interspaces with shrubs, which increases the risk of fire spread, which decreases native habitat, which increases invasive annual grasses and starts that cycle all over again. So here in Las Vegas, that's what these fires end up looking like. We have grass, which is bad for tortoises, leads to fires, also bad for tortoises, gets rid of habitat, and then the cycle continues. So there's some research that supports what I'm saying here. Christina Drake et al. In 2015, there were about 25,000 hectares of wildfires and critical habitat designated for the recovery of the Mojave Desert Tortoise, and this happened in 2005 and 2006. The research showed that these tortoises will move back into these burned habitats for the first 5 years after the fire. So they'll go in, get food, come back out, hang out under the shrubs in unburned areas. So for a while they were using these burned habitats, but by years 6 and 7, the short-lived herbaceous perennial plants like globe mallow that can survive in these burned areas were declining because they were reaching the end of their life cycles. And so tortoises were not using these areas anymore. So some more research by Christina Drake. Tortoises had these different diets, native forbs, native grasses, invasive grasses, and then native forbs with a combination of native or invasive grass. The tortoises eating the native forbs had overall just much better body condition and immune functions. They grew more, they had higher survival rates. And so these tortoises that had native forbs were in good condition. Unfortunately, the tortoises that were eating only native grass or invasive grass were either dead or removed from the experiment because they were doing so poorly. They had seeds from the invasive annual grasses stuck in their tongues, in their mouths, which is causing other health problems for those tortoises. And then there were even at the gene level different transcribed gene functions because of the certain diets they were on with invasive annual grasses. So the thought is that that's leading, even after they're maybe moving into a better diet, they're still going to have issues because of what they were eating at that time. So here are some sad pictures of juvenile desert tortoises on a grass diet. You can see, maybe if you're not familiar, some of these tortoises are just skinny for what they should be. And then some pictures of the brome actually stuck in their mouths and eyes. So all that to say, that's what got me interested in AIM, is we have this threatened species. We're supposed to be recovering habitat on a large scale, so over 3 million acres in the Southern Nevada district. And do we really know what the quality of habitat is in our district? And my thought was, even as the natural resource specialist for the district, no, I don't really know. So we, at this point, when I started looking at this data, this was in 2016, 2017, we'd had about 5 to 6 years of AIM data at that point, so about 300 AIM plots. All of this tortoise information and just general questions about what habitat was like in our district led me to looking at some of these benchmarks for the district, specifically geared towards Mojave Desert tortoise. And this is something that the NOC has been pushing to. But they're a national AIM effort to monitor land use plan effectiveness. And this led to me looking at our AIM data up to that point in time, just as an informal assessment of like, what does our habitat look like on the ground from AIM data right now? So to get at that, part of what I did is I messed with the data a little bit. So I looked at relative cover of invasive annual grasses, just because we have such low cover of any vegetation in the desert anyways. I wanted these numbers to be representative of what was on the ground, to feel like they meant something, especially when we're presenting them to managers. So this is the number of invasive annual grass hits divided by the total number of vegetation hits on the line point intercept data. So what that's getting at is what percentage of all the vegetation on the sites in our district are made up of invasive annual grasses. So this is just a summary of that mapping exercise I was doing in 2016 and 2017. And the areas shown in dark green outline are our desert tortoise critical habitat units in Southern Nevada. So you can see that these covers represented by the neon green dots are pretty high in our critical habitat units. So especially in this area on the furthest east part of the map, that's Gold Butte National Monument, which overlaps that critical habitat unit. And most of the AIM points we have in there had over 15% relative cover of invasive annual grass. So even just this desktop exercise was really concerning to me at first. So this was with another map. This shows a benchmark that I set up sort of arbitrarily, but I said that we didn't want more than 20% relative cover of invasive annual grass throughout the district. Again, that's still pretty high, but I think my thought was that probably was a lower fire risk and left room for other native annual species. So with that 20% relative cover goal, the green dots are AIM plots that were meeting that benchmark as of 2017, and the red dots are plots that were not meeting that benchmark. And again, these are our critical habitat units that are supposed to be there for the recovery of the Mojave Desert tortoise. These don't get touched by solar projects, they don't get touched by development. We focus restoration efforts on them, and to me, clearly something is wrong here. That this is what this is the data that our AIM plots is showing us. So To summarize those maps, only 48% of the plots in critical habitat had less than 20% relative cover of invasive annual grass. So over 50% had higher cover than that. Only 35% of the plots in critical habitat had less than 10% relative cover of invasive annual grass. So what we're looking at is that this problem is systemic throughout the district. So we know that there is this tie between invasive annual grasses, wildfires. So it seems like it would make sense, okay, let's overlay old fire perimeters and maybe that's going to explain all of our weeds issues. So we'd expect that we're going to see higher invasive grass covers within those fire perimeters. So this map is a little bit busy, but all of the big red polygons show historic fires up until 2016. Again, those neon green points represent AIM points and the relative cover of invasive annual grass. So what I take away from this is that the invasive annual grass problems are not just related to wildfire, and maybe there's some edge effects of the wildfire. The grasses are taking over after a wildfire and spreading, but there are some disjunct points that just don't seem like they're related to this. So it's not just we have a fire and we have a problem. We have a problem without the fires. And so something else that's also cueing me into is that probably we have increased fire risk even in areas that haven't burned in these critical habitat units, which is, again, super concerning because it's hard to get that habitat back once it's lost. So I also set some just test benchmarks based on ecological site descriptions of the critical habitat units. So this is using relative native shrub cover. So this does seem to somewhat be explained by the fire perimeter. So where you have a fire, you have not the amount of shrub cover you would expect. But again, there's some weird relics of AIM plots that haven't been burned over, or we don't have records of those fires, and they still seem like maybe they're not meeting ESD expectations. This is a relative invasive cover as a whole, so I added in any non-grass annual weeds. And so again, just to show that these numbers are high in critical habitat units, and specifically in Gold Butte, which we're sort of looking at specifically here. So this GIS exercise made me think, okay, so what do these plots look like? And we have all these great AIM photos from when the crews were out there on the ground. So on the map on the left, you can see the point circled that I pulled up the photos for. So this site had 37 to 54% relative invasive annual grass cover. So again, I'm looking at this and I'm just thinking, I mean, this is in, I think, oh, it's late May, so it's a little late in the season, but this is Gold Butte, so it's higher elevation. I just would expect to see more annual forbs than what I'm seeing. It looks like a lot of grass to me. And again, so this site, the actual percentage, I went and back and looked up, and it's got almost 40% relative cover of invasive annual grass. So, that's a big chunk of all of the vegetation biomass on that site. So another step I did was to take relative forb cover and overlay that on invasive annual grass cover. So what I've got is basically showing, okay, so where we have high invasive annual grass cover, we don't have high forb cover. And there's obviously no causal effect from this. This is just me looking at the data that we have. But to me, it makes me concerned about the habitat, because it doesn't seem like this is a good situation for somebody like the tortoise who's relying on vegetation to survive. So just some more photos showing what these high covers of brome look like. So again, this site had a relative cover of 74% invasive annual grasses, and that is just, again, this is outside of a burned area. This is important critical desert tortoise habitat, and this is just really not good news for our critical habitat units. So 30% of the AIM plots in Gold Butte, when I did this analysis, had an invasive annual grass cover over 50%. And I think that that's bad from a fire risk perspective, from what are these tortoises eating perspective, the risk of fire to eventually kill off shrubs that these tortoises depend on. So there's a lot of different things that this just makes me think about. And I messed around a lot with the ecological site descriptions for these sites because I was trying to find some kind of metric of, okay, what should this site look like? So how can we tell if the site is doing okay or not? So the ESDs have this relative percent cover of shrubs, native grasses, and native forbs. So I did some, again, just GIS work trying to compare what our ESDs suggested with the AIM plot information to see how far the AIM plots are from departure from the ESDs. So here's the relative native shrub cover. That's the lighter blue color, and the darker blue cover is the ESD expected shrub cover. And this is only shown for the critical habitat units. Again, those areas that are in this dark green color, just because it's a tough data set to try to morph into something that you can look at side by side with the AIM data. But again, what I'm seeing is that the shrub cover, especially in Gold Butte and even in this other critical habitat unit on the north end of our district, which is Mormon Mesa, the shrub covers are not what is expected by the ESD. And yes, I know there are 100 qualifiers for using it this way, but if you're just looking for maybe red flags for habitat, I think that this is one. And as people who work for the Bureau of Land Management, we don't just manage critical habitat. So I also did some overlays with things like the desert tortoise's high value contiguous habitat. There's a lot of modeling that's occurred for desert tortoise. So part of what I'm asking myself is, okay, so we know we've done all this really expensive modeling to find out where is important contiguous habitat. And our office, and I'm sure a lot of other offices in the Mojave, do a ton of work trying to keep these contiguous habitat patches intact so that gene flow can occur between populations. Well, so what is the status of the habitat in these corridors that we're protecting? I mean, if we're keeping things out of there, but the habitat is so degraded that no tourist would want to live there, what are we doing? Like, what good are we doing? So these are, again, these are the relative invasive annual grass covers, which you've seen before, just on the larger scale. And I'm especially looking at, you can see Las Vegas, and then to the west of Las Vegas is Pahrump. And all of these, if you can see my cursor, all of these big black dots are showing high relative invasive annual grass covers in the super narrow, really important tortoise connectivity corridor. So I just zoomed in on that corridor. We have our relative invasive grass covers up again. And again, this is a pretty, for a tortoise, especially because this increases in elevation pretty quickly as you head to the east. This is a small corridor and important, but these invasive annual grass covers are, again, much higher than I would expect, you know, just as, I like to assume that our district is in pretty good shape. So this plot that I'm showing here that was circled on the previous slide has 64% relative invasive grass cover. When you look at the ecological site description, the site's supposed to be a blackbrush, big guyetta, desert needlegrass ecological site. And I mean, looking at it, probably to those of you in the Great Basin, it looks shockingly dry. But to me, that looks like it could support those grass species. So according to the ESD, it could support 10% cover of native perennial grass, and it has none. It also should be able, again, according to the ESD, be able to support 85% relative shrub cover, and it only has 34%. So again, there could be a lot of things going on. There could be drought, there could be other things, but I do think when I see a site like this where I kind of agree with the ESD, yeah, I think that's what it could support. Well, why aren't those things there? Why don't we have higher shrub cover? Why is the invasive annual grass cover so high? And so for some context, I overlaid our herd management area. And I forget what the exact numbers are at the last time we had a count for this area, but like I think most other places in the BLM, we're way over AML right now. So, and this is also within this darker green boundary is a historic grazing allotment. And so, again, I'm not drawing any conclusions, but I just think it is important to look at the context of what's going on in the area you're concerned about. And I mean, I think it should at least point us in the direction of asking questions about how past management has led to what's going on right now. So again, here's that high value contiguous habitat for desert tortoise. That's the modeling, and showing these higher, between 17 and 30% on average invasive annual grass covers through this corridor, which again, pretty high, increased fire risk. What are these tortoises eating? And so the last piece of this that I looked at is in the context of a rapid ecological assessment, which I forget what year they were done, but they were pretty popular with BLM for a while. So this is big picture. They use scientific information and data to identify resource conditions and trends in ecoregions. So the point was to look at habitats that are important to sensitive species and then gauge the potential of those habitats to be affected by things. So climate change, wildfires, invasive species, urban and energy development. So what this was trying to look for is patterns of environmental change that might not be evident if you're just focusing on, say, your field office or this critical habitat unit. So this is just a quote from the former BLM Nevada State Director. And I won't read it, but the gist of it is essentially that these REAs are supposed to tell us where our really important areas of conservation are, areas that aren't going to be developed, areas that are more resistant to climate change. That's really important for holistic land use planning. So this is the ecoregional assessment, and I've overlaid my relative invasive annual grass cover, which I'm pretty much harping on at this point. But so these dark green areas are considered ecological core areas. So these areas are supposed to be more resistant to climate change, further away from development, places that we should be, from the REA's perspective, thinking about protecting long-term for species, especially for recovery. Well, so if you look at the invasive annual grass cover, these areas that are supposed to be resistant have burned over, they have high invasive annual grass covers, which I think long-term is probably going to make them less resistant to climate change because they're not ecologically intact anymore. And so I think we just need to shift our way of thinking and maybe just be a little more concerned about, what we thought was ecological core might not be anymore. And I think that it's hard to shift our perspective on things like that, especially when we already have management boundaries drawn over it. So critical habitat units, national conservation areas, things like that. So to make a long story short, the Mojave is a shrub-dominated ecosystem. Invasive annual grasses carry fire. And these invasive annual grasses are probably competing with annual forbs. There's not a lot of good research on this, at least for the Mojave right now, but it's something I am working on. These changes with invasive annual grasses coming in, changing the fire cycle, replacing these shrub-dominated ecosystems should be a concern for BLM, for Fish and Wildlife Service, for any land managers out there. And I think even though it's not, again, I'm just looking at general data and I can't draw direct conclusions from any of it, but I think that it's harder to ignore this trend when we're looking at this type of AIM data, especially when we have it over, 5 to 10 years. And Southern Nevada, I think, is working on year 8 or 9 of AIM data right now. So I don't think we can expect tortoises to recover in areas that don't have primary constituent critical elements. So things like food and habitat, they need those for recovery, and a lot of their habitat, even in critical habitat units, isn't meeting that. So again, these high invasive grass covers are concerning for desert tortoise recovery. And the story I'm trying to tell in my district is that if these vegetation communities are on a downward trend, which I think the AIM data for our district is showing, we should also expect tortoise populations to be in a downward trend, even absent of any of the other threats that they're facing. And if you've been through a species listing before, you know that there's a whole list of things. So habitat is just often a minor component. And I'll go through this fast, but these things, especially the invasive annual grass cover, are especially important to juvenile desert tortoises. So this research by Justin Congdon was done on turtle species, but it relates to desert tortoise, and that juveniles, their growth rate is directly related to survival and reproduction later in life. So long story short, the tortoises, which are maybe the size of your ID card when they're little, need to grow as fast as possible, both to survive, so not be raven food anymore, not get hit on roads as much anymore, but also to be able to reproduce more quickly over their lifetime. So what the research that Christina Drake has shown is that juvenile tortoises don't grow and often die if all they have to eat is invasive annual grasses. We have critical habitat units that are dominated by invasive annual grasses. And then we have all these other threats that are facing desert tortoises right now, and all of your other species too that you guys are working with. And so it's just this extra pressure that is making it harder and harder for them to reach an adult age. So to start to wrap up what I'm thinking about after, I've been doing all of this look into what's going on with our AIM data, what's going on with desert tortoise habitat, I really have been trying to put myself in the shoes or little feet of these juvenile desert tortoises. I may need help skipping this slide. All right, so I really am trying to picture myself as this juvenile desert tortoise, and my landscape is now dominated by things like red brown, which I can't eat, or maybe I can eat, but it's going to kill me. And so these guys have really limited home ranges. They don't move very far, especially when they're this size, because it's so dangerous for them. And so I know what Christina Drake from USGS has gotten a lot of pushback about is like, well, even if there's a lot of invasive annual grass, they're going to focus on the annuals. Well, how are you, as this little juvie tortoise, going to find those annuals in this landscape? Especially if there's, as I suspect, some kind of competitive advantage that the brome has over the native annuals. And these little guys, you can see them on the road, face a lot of challenges in Southern Nevada, and most of them we can't control. So I think we need more information about the things we can't control, And I think habitat is one of those things. I think it can seem kind of daunting, but we do have the ability to do restoration projects, to do weed treatments, things like that that can really improve habitat, especially if we know where the problems are. So to make these good management decisions about how to improve habitat, we need to understand what good habitat is. So something ideally, from my perspective, that we can relate back to standard measurements like AIM. So how can we get a better handle on habitat quality for desert tortoises? So I was all about this benchmark development. I worked on it a lot in 2017, 2018, 2019 when I could find the time. It was hard, even with all of the resource specialists in our office in a room, to agree on a range because we just didn't feel like we had enough information. Tortoise habitat is super variable. It ranges over 4 states. And so it's hard to just say they need X shrub cover or they need X annual cover in order to survive. And there's not a lot of good quantitative data that ties into our AIM indicators. So, I'm sure you guys have all been waiting for this. What do we do about it? And my solution was to partner with the USGS out of Henderson here, Todd Eskew and Christina Drake. And we are working on a project called Quantifying Habitat Quality in relation to tortoise habitat use, demography, health, and response indices. So BLM funded this project in 2019, and the project is based around using AIM data to figure out what good tortoise habitat quality is. So we're going to try to correlate vegetation communities and quantitative vegetation attributes that AIM collects with tortoise health responses. So there's a lot of other research that BLM is funding USGS to do, and this dovetails nicely with all of that. And the goal of it really is to provide us with things that tortoises need in habitat that are tied to AIM data so that we can use our existing AIM data to look at habitat quality across the district as it relates to desert tortoises. So one of the objectives will be to develop AIM-based benchmarks for tortoise habitat. So things like, what is the maximum invasive annual grass cover in tortoise habitat that juvenile tortoises can tolerate and still reach adulthood, because that's really important for recovery of the species. And then another, again, potential example is maybe what minimum shrub cover or shrub height constitutes good tortoise habitat. So our higher tortoise density is tied to a particular set of habitat conditions that would be helpful for us to know too, especially for large-scale planning, including things like solar energy siting. The goal is for USGS to develop a user guide for managers and AIM practitioners to identify AIM data that can be tied to tortoise habitat quality, again, through the use of benchmarks. And the format is going to be loosely based on the HAF document, obviously more geared towards desert tortoises, and I really want solid benchmarks that we can use to tell us what we need to do for tortoise habitat quality. So I think that this is going to be really powerful once we have the data to communicate habitat conditions to BLM management and to our partners, so Fish and Wildlife Service, NDOW, the Nevada Division of Wildlife, and the public. We could use it in land use planning and renewable energy siting, again, because we already have all this AIM data, we just need to know how it relates to tortoise habitat quality. Prioritize restoration projects. Leverage funding for projects because you can show the quality of the habitat through data. Rule out or rule in translocation areas based on habitat quality, and direct fuels treatments to prevent future fires in areas where we know we have these high covers of invasive annual grasses. So here's some project details and updates. This project was fully funded in 2019. The first full year is going to be 2021, and the project will be, it's funded for 3 years initially with a potential for expansion into another 2 years. We have an IAA with USGS in place and the setup for the project in place. We had AIM crews mobilized and contracted to start work in 2020, but they couldn't start work because of COVID-19. So we delayed the project rather than only having several months of data for a host of reasons, but basically it's it's complicated to begin with, and then splitting years was going to make it really rough on both BLM and USGS. Here's where the project sites are. So Las Vegas is kind of in the upper center of the map. We have 2 sites, Stump Springs and Hidden Valley, that will have juvenile tortoises because they have a faster response time to change. I probably should have said this at the beginning, but tortoises are super long-lived, so upwards of 40 to 50 years in the wild. So it takes them, just because of their history, a long time to show responses to change, and so we're hoping the additions of these juvenile releases will show faster changes as it relates to the habitat quality. And then we have 3 other sites that have 10 adults that are being tracked as part of ongoing USGS research, so they'll be included in this project as well. So here's some details about the project. We've got the 5 sites that I showed in the previous map. There's 4 plots at each of those sites, so 4 aim plots. And then there will be 5 sampling periods. So we're actually resampling these plots 5 times a year every year for 3 years. So we're collecting the core methods. I just summarized some of them here. And then also supplemental methods, including forb diversity and annual production, because we expect that those will be important to desert tortoises. Another component of the project is trying to link AIM data with existing remote sensing data. This is something that people have been trying to do for a long time, but since we have these on the ground measurements, USGS is also going to try to correlate that better with remote sensing data so that we can see things like invasive annual grass cover, maybe just from aerial imagery. Climatic conditions, so we'll have 2 weather stations at each of those 5 sites. We have 15 rain gauges at a site, and we're measuring precipitation, humidity, and temperature at each of those sites. So the linking the habitat characteristics with the tortoise condition, we'll have the tortoise responses monthly measured through habitat use and movement of the site. So USGS will be tracking the tortoises with the GPS monitoring or VHF. They'll also be looking at things like growth and mass changes, clinical health conditions, body condition scores, and demographic profiles. We're also looking at the physiological responses of tortoises. So these things will be done once in September, so after the full growing season, and tortoises are about to go back into estivation. So genetic responses, oxidative status, enzymatic, antioxidant activity, immune function, and stress. So all of these things are more specific quantitative data about tortoise health that USGS is hoping to glean really good ties to what they've been eating all year. And then they'll also look at pathogen loads every other year. So for juvenile releases, like I mentioned, juvenile desert tortoises are much more responsive to change. And so 2 of our sites will have juveniles. We also funded another add-on to this study this year to look at what the juvenile tortoises are actually eating, so bite count study, which is exciting because both it would be super cute to be able to follow these little babies around and watch what they're eating, but also because we're going to know exactly what they ate and then how that relates to their health later on. So I think that that's going to be a really important tie back into AIM data. So unfortunately, because of COVID, the universal scapegoat, we won't have any. I don't have anything to share with you this year, but I think we'll have really exciting results in a couple of years, and I think it's really going to help tie tortoise habitat quality to AIM data, and I think hopefully what we're doing can be applicable to other species. And I'm done, so I'm happy to take any questions, or you can email me if you want to get in touch about what we're working on, but thanks for having me. It was really nice to talk to you all today.
Thank you, Lara. That was a great presentation. I feel like I learned a lot about tortoises and their habitat, and I feel like they're lucky to have advocates like you that are willing to dive into the data. So thanks a ton. This is just a last kind of announcement for questions for Lara. So if you do have any questions that you want wanted answered right now, please type them into the live event Q&A up at the top right of your screen. But Lara, we did have a couple questions for you. So a lot of good comments and a question here from Jessica Phillips about utilization cages. So have you put out any small exclosures or utilization cages to see if native grasses and forbs are present but being grazed prior to monitoring?
We haven't. I think that would be really interesting. I think my suspicion is, at least in a couple of the examples I presented, and I didn't talk about this for the Gold Butte site, but the Gold Butte site has illegal cattle grazing. It has a wild horse and burro HMA that's over AML there. And so I think my suspicion is that those things have been grazed out. I don't have for sure evidence, but especially in the example I showed that was near Pahrump, that site we've monitored a couple other times, and there's not even any perennial grass that's just grazed down. It's just gone. And so I think it's just been heavily used enough that it's been eliminated from the site. I think, especially in Gold Butte, it'd be interesting to put some exclosures up, but unfortunately, due to the illegal cattle use, it's harder to make sure they stay up.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Jessica is, are any of these areas considered for targeted or prescribed grazing in the recent Nevada BLM EA or the Programmatic Great Basin EA for invasive species management? So any targeted grazing, prescribed grazing going on in these areas?
Yeah, so we were not involved in that EA just because we're Mojave. All of our allotments are ephemeral, so I think if we could target it enough, it might be useful, but for a host of reasons that grazing is excluded under our biological opinions. There's a whole history of Clark County having purchased a lot of our historic grazing allotments for conservation for desert tortoise. So I think it's it's sort of a complicated answer, but to sum it up, I think it's just too complicated down here, especially some of these areas where we have a history of illegal use. I don't think it's sending the right message, and the illegal use that's occurred, I think, has probably made the problem worse to a certain extent by grazing out the preferred species. And what's moved in is just the invasive stuff, complicated by the fact that we've had these wildfires with no rest because there's, again, illegal grazing. And so, yeah, I don't know that it's the best approach down here.
Thank you. So another question here from Anonymous is, you might have said this, but was there any difference between the habitat inside versus outside the HMAs, or any difference between them?
I don't think that there was enough for me to draw conclusions. And again, this was all, this is a little outdated at this point. It's like I had this time to work on this in like 2016, and I would love to just go back and look at it again, because again, now we have 4 additional years of AIM data and we've started our revisit panel. And so I think it would be really interesting to see how some of those things have changed for better or for worse, and maybe to more specifically look at inside and outside HMAs, but that wasn't really what I was focused on. And so I didn't really draw any conclusions about that.
Yeah, it'd be great I agree to go back and revisit that, and especially now that you may have some like trend data or a larger sample size, it might be possible to have a a bigger inference area or kind of do like a weighted analysis approach. So yeah, I'd love to follow up with anything like that. But cool, thanks for that answer. So the next couple of questions are kind of more general questions, I think, about AIM. So Lara, did you have any advice for folks who are just starting to dive into the AIM data in their office? What are some keys to your success that you want to share with others?
I don't know if I can say I've been successful yet, so I won't specifically speak to that. I do think if you have the GIS background, it makes it a lot easier, because I think looking at these things geospatially is super powerful. So I guess if you don't have a GIS background, I would recommend taking some classes, getting comfortable for it. And then there's some really good tutorials about how to get logged into the terrestrial data through the NOC and through Hornada. And so I would definitely check that out and get comfortable with the geospatial part, because it's just the easiest way to look at it. And I think that if you're talking to managers and stuff, at least, I mean, you guys can tell me what you think, but I think seeing those, how many points we have and what that looks like across the landscape is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. Being able to look at the data spatially is so helpful, and then you can start to kind of draw some patterns between what's out there, what the landscape looks like, and current management, like you've done with fires and grazing and things. So yeah, that's a great tip. So I think just one more question right now, unless anyone has any more questions, type them in and we'll try and get them answered. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Lara over email. So the last question is, could you talk more about the challenges with setting benchmarks? Is whatever team you are working with on board with the USGS study? Great example of being proactive and figuring out how to fill an information gap, by the way.
Yeah, so I thought that the whole idea of the benchmarks, I think, is super powerful, but I think it's going to be challenging for anybody, because it's really hard. And I think probably in the long term, this is something that NOC can help with more, but it's because our districts are all so different, it's hard to say, like, okay, well, we have this line point intercept data. How does that actually relate to, what our land use plan says? It's just like, there's a really big gap, like you said. So I guess I'm hoping that people will just like make some initial judgment calls. Like we were talking about the 20% cover. I mean, it's something that when I was talking to the other resource specialists I was working with, so we had a meeting with wildlife biologists, our fuel specialists, our weed specialists, everybody I could get into a meeting together, a restoration coordinator. We all kind of agreed that, yeah, 20% relative cover of invasive annual grasses seems like a good benchmark for reducing fire risk, for making sure tortoises can succeed. And our concern was just that if we're going to ask our district manager to make sweeping decisions about how we do restoration, maybe addressing some bigger projects, pursuing more funding, it felt like we needed something more quantitative, and that's how we ended up with USGS. So I don't really know how to get around that. I think it's kind of unfortunate, but I think all of us are just going to have a hard time with management unless we can say, yes, USGS told us if it's over this, if whatever is over this benchmark, then our species can't recover. Like if we have that kind of quantitative data, no one can argue with us anymore. Like we have to do these things or we're not meeting our responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act. So I'm hoping people can find existing research for their species of concern or whatever, but it's tough. I hope I answered that adequately.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer, and I for one am super excited about seeing where the USGS study goes. Lots of really cool data being collected there, and I feel like that is kind of one of the best ways often of making those site-specific or benchmarks, is having these kind of more intensive experimental studies. So really cool to see that, and excited for the future in there. I think that's, oh, okay, we have one more question here. So is red brome, Bromus rubens, the dominant invasive annual grass you're dealing with? I think you also mentioned cheatgrass, right?
Yeah, it's mostly red brome. We have a little bit of cheatgrass as it gets into the more northern or cooler parts of our field office. We're also dealing with Mediterranean grass, so Schismus species, and we're working on a separate research project right now to look at are those things different in terms of like forage quality for tortoise. My thought is that they're kind of not. I mean, some areas we have Schismus infestations that are as bad as red brome, but the paradigm seems to be like, oh, Schismus isn't that bad, red brome bad, Schismus not so bad. And so hopefully in a couple of years we'll have some better research to help answer that question.
Great, thanks, Lara. Yeah, so I think that's all the questions. I guess we can wrap up the webinar. Just a reminder here that we are recording the webinar, and we'll put it up on BLM SharePoint as shown here on the slide. So feel free to jot down that address or reach out to one of us to find that on the AIM SharePoint site. You can find the recordings there. And I think next week we have just 2 more presentations upcoming. So if you're interested, next week I believe we have Nicholas Webb from the Hornada joining us to talk about his research into wind erosion and using data for that. So I think that's all we have for today. So thanks everyone for your participation, questions, and thanks again, Lara, for a great presentation. See you next week.